Hello, everyone. This is part one of week 6 of Plato, a class on the Protagoras, Phaedo, and Sophist. We are currently talking about the Phaedo, and we now turn to the third or second, depending on the way you count, argument for the immortality of the soul, which is called the Affinity argument. And the main intuition here is that the soul is akin or has affinity with other kinds of things of which we think that they are immortal. So, what are these other kinds of things? Being and the divine. Now, the argument works with 3 distinctions, and I'm going to talk through them and raise some questions about that. The first distinction is between what is composite and non-composite. Socrates suggests that it is likely, and that is the technical term, the Greek is Eikos. It is likely that the soul is non-composite. Something that is composite has been put together and accordingly is also going to fall apart again. Something that is non-composite has not been put together and thus is also not going to fall apart again. So the soul is likely to be a non-composite entity. Now, just a word about this notion of it being likely Eikos, that the soul is non-composite. This term is center stage in a later dialogue, Plato's Timaeus, which is about cosmology and Plato's account of nature or the universe and human beings within the universe. And here, Plato explicitly, in a kind of strong way, flags that his account, and he calls it an account, a logos, but he also calls it a mythos, the myth, is only going to be likely. Kind of flagging that when we theorize about nature, we are simply not in a position to come up with an account that is anything better than that. It is not like doing mathematics, even though mathematics is involved, but it is not like those fields, presumably mathematics being one of them, that permit a greater kind of epistemic confidence. Now, I want to just sort of bring to your attention that it is interesting that our soul and the cosmos seem to both fall into that category of which we can only give a likely account. Of course, it is an open question whether this notion should be interpreted in the same way in the Phaedo and the Timaeus, and probably not in precisely the same way, but nevertheless, that is something to think about. Now, the second and the third distinction that come up in the affinity argument are the distinction between, on the one hand, being, that is the counter term to what so far we call becoming. So here, being, and on the other hand, what is visible and changing. And then a distinction between the divine and the mortal. And the divine is superior and ruling, whereas the mortal is subservient to the divine. Now, in both cases, Socrates, as it were, just sort of stipulates that the soul is more akin to the former, to being, and to the divine. And an obvious criticism here of this argument, if it is supposed to be a proof, or at least an argument for the immortality of the soul, is, you want to prove that the soul is immortal, but we're somehow then just adding a premise according to which it is like the things of which we anyway think they are immortal, namely divinity and being. So, as an argument, the affinity argument has received a lot of criticism. I want to make the same suggestion, however, that I made when we talked about the first argument for the immortality of the soul, namely that we look at it nevertheless as what could it tell us about Plato's metaphysics? And are there some ideas here which we can take away even if we do not think that we have a successful argument for the immortality of the soul? Now, that seems to me to be the case just with respect to precisifying this notion of being. So far, we talked more about becoming, and we haven't talked a lot about being, as per the other side of this big divide in Plato's Metaphysics. Being is here characterized as eternal, unchanging, not sense perceptible, immutable, always self-same. That is a kind of technical expression. And its counterpart, the visible or the sense perceptible, is never the same as itself, or in other words, changing. So just as a kind of spelling out of the metaphysics, that seems noteworthy and important, and it has another major upshot for how we think of sense perception in the Phaedo. Sense perception seems to be associated with the body. Now, throughout Plato's philosophy, there is a big question of what sense perception is, because on the one hand, it may seem to be a mental state. You see something, and that is a representation in the mind or the soul. But then you see with your eyes, or you hear with your ears, and sense perception seems to be, at least in the Phaedo, some kind of tie to the bodily world. Now, in the Phaedo, sense perception is very strongly characterized as bodily. And it is a major question in scholarship whether that is something that Plato is going to move away from. And for now, I just want to invite you to think about that as a genuine puzzle. What is the connection between sense perception and the body?